The crack of her palm hitting the desk landed like a hammer against the air, hard enough to jolt the pens from their tray, and in that instant, the entire lobby of Everest National Bank felt as if someone had squeezed the breath out of it. Mallory Price, her ice-blue eyes, sharp as steel, stood rigid behind counter number 3, her face tight with anger and arrogance. "Step back from my desk right now." She barked her voice, carrying so far that customers at the far end of the room flinched. "We do not process transactions like this for people like you." The words "people like you" hit the floor with a heavy thud, driving straight into the man standing in front of her. Daniel Carter, 45 years old, tall, calm, dressed in a simple but spotless coat, just stood there. He didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't react, just bent down to gather the stack of documents Mallory had slapped away, as if they were contaminated. And though his hands were steady, there was the faintest tremble, not from fear, but from a cold, familiar sting, rising from memories he thought he had buried long ago. Customers around them began whispering. Some turned their backs to avoid being involved. Others glanced over with a mix of curiosity and disappointment, bracing for yet another act of discrimination. But Daniel looked at all of them with an expression impossible to read, calm but sorrowful, yet deep enough to suggest he carried something none of them could see. Mallory tilted her head and gave a thin smile, the kind worn by someone convinced they held absolute power. She shoved the ID Daniel had handed over toward the edge of the counter, as if it wasn't worth a second look. "You actually think I believe you have $50,000 in your account?" she hissed. "You got real paperwork, or just things you picked up?" Somewhere Daniel answered evenly, "You can verify it. All the information is valid." But Mallory shook her head, arms crossing one hand on her hip like she was the star of her own stage. "Security, get over here to counter 3. Heavy footsteps approached. Lucas Dean, the bank's security officer, came forward with his hand hovering near his radio, like he was waiting for permission to restrain Daniel on the spot. Lucas wasn't malicious, but the hesitation in his eyes showed he wasn't sure whether he was about to make a very big mistake. Mallory didn't hesitate at all. She pointed at Daniel like he was a threat. "He's trying to make an illegal transaction. I'm not processing it." The entire bank slipped into a tense, suffocating silence, filled with judgment. Daniel slowly lifted his head, looked at Mallory, then at Lucas, then at everyone watching, and for a brief moment, he seemed to look straight through them, seeing their fear, their discomfort, and the silence society had taught them to keep. He asked only one question. "Are you refusing to serve me?" At that moment, as if to assert authority. Thomas Gray, the branch manager, walked over. A 41-year-old man with a slightly crooked tie and the face of someone who believed he had the right to judge anyone. "What's going on?" Mallory answered loudly, making sure everyone heard. "He thinks he can walk in here and transfer $50,000. Thomas looked Daniel up and down deliberately, then curled his lips into a half-smile. "You should try a bank that's more suitable." Daniel held his gaze. "Suitable by what standard?" Thomas shrugged. "Our standard." The words locked the room in place, sealing the moment like a cage around everyone's emotions. Daniel inhaled slowly. No one knew what he felt, whether it was pain, anger, or simply the exhaustion of encountering yet another glimpse of a world he knew too well. Then, unexpectedly, he stepped back, pulled out his phone and said quietly, "Just a moment." He made a call. Only 8 seconds. No one heard what he said. No one knew who he spoke to. But from the way he put the phone away and stood still, everyone felt something shift. Something they couldn't name. 30 seconds later, Lights flickered. The vault door slammed shut. Every monitor in the branch went dark, then flashed into emergency mode. A glowing red message appeared. Branch temporarily suspended. Executive board en route. Mallory went pale. Thomas froze, sweat gathering at his palms. Lucas stepped back half a pace. The entire lobby seemed to drop into another world. And Daniel. He remained still silent, as if he had known exactly what would happen. No one understood how a phone call lasting only a few seconds could freeze an entire bank. No one knew who the man they had just belittled really was. But they were about to find out. And when the truth hit, it would change the lives of every person standing in that room. Part 1 ends in a heavy silence, the silence of people who have just misjudged someone they never should have underestimated. The automatic glass doors of Everest National Bank slid open again, but this time it was not an ordinary customer. It was an arrival so powerful, it felt as though the entire room had been drained of oxygen. Charlotte Reed, 52 years old, regional director, entered with the urgent stride of someone who had been sprinting against time, followed closely by 2 senior executives, dressed in suits so precise they were almost intimidating. Her grey hair was neatly pinned back, her expression severe, and her eyes sharp as a blade, enough to make every employee in the lobby freeze where they stood. She did not need to ask a single question. One glance told her everything had collapsed. "Where is he?" Charlotte demanded, before she even caught her breath. Mallory Price, her face completely drained of color, trembling uncontrollably, pointed toward Daniel Carter, as if pointing at a ghost come back to claim a debt. It was him he was trying to commit fraud. But Charlotte didn't let her finish. No. Him. Her voice was so sharp that several customers jolted backward in shock. She strode straight toward Daniel, and what happened next sent a suffocating wave of disbelief through the entire bank. "Mr. Carter, my deepest apologies for the delay," Charlotte said, her tone dropping into absolute respect. "We had no idea you would be visiting this branch today." In that moment, everyone understood the situation had spun miles beyond anything they could have imagined. Thomas Gray froze, as if struck from behind. Lucas Dean, who had been poised to restrain Daniel, instantly lowered his hand from his radio and stepped aside in utter confusion. Mallory looked as though someone had slammed a fist into her chest, her breath breaking in panicked gasps. They all understood now. Daniel was not people like you, as Mallory had called him. What is happening?" a customer whispered, but no one answered. Charlotte turned to face the entire lobby, her expression so firm it commanded absolute stillness. "I need everyone to listen," she said, and in the next breath, the clicking keyboards, the whirring printers, and the hushed murmurs all died out, as though someone had pressed pause on the whole world. "Mr. Daniel Carter, Charlotte," said clearly, enunciating each word, "is the largest shareholder of Everest National Bank. He oversees the entire system, the entire region, every branch, including everyone standing in this room." 20 phones nearly slipped from hands at the same time. Several customers stood frozen with their mouths open. An elderly woman near the door pressed a hand to her chest like she might faint. Security guard Lucas blinked rapidly, his voice caught in his throat. Mallory collapsed halfway downward, gripping the edge of the counter as if letting go would make her crumble to the floor. And Daniel, he simply stood there, wearing that same calm expression, but in his eyes was something that looked like sadness, the sadness of a man far too familiar with the true face of systems people believe are unshakable. "I didn't know," Mallory whispered, her voice trembling near the edge of tears. That Charlotte replied, locking eyes with her, is the problem. You did not know because you did not bother to know. You looked at him and decided he was not worthy of being served. The words sliced through the lobby like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Thomas tried to force a smile to regain control, but the smile was crooked, shaky, and vanished the instant Charlotte turned toward him. "Mr. Gray," she said, her tone cold. "Can you explain why a customer, no matter who he is, was treated like a criminal for attempting to make a legitimate transaction?" Sweat pooled at Thomas's collar. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His fear spread through the room like a raw, tangible force. Charlotte turned back to Daniel. "So would you like us to bring you to the VIP room to complete your transaction?" Daniel shook his head, gently but firmly. "That won't be necessary." Another shockwave ripped through the lobby, just as intense as the first. "I've already transferred the funds to another bank." Thomas exhaled sharply, as though punched in the gut. A nearby employee stepped back, realizing the branch had just lost one of the region's most powerful accounts, and someone capable of costing the entire system far more. "And one more thing," Daniel added, his voice deep and steady, each word heavy as stone. "This afternoon, the board will meet to review all operations in this region. Not just this branch. The air thickened like molten lead. A young employee nearly lost balance and gripped a desk for support. Lucas swallowed hard, Mallory broke into uncontrollable sobs, and Thomas shook violently, like a man hearing his own verdict. Yet what silenced the room wasn't the impending consequences. It was Daniel's calm, a calm so controlled it was terrifying, a calm that proved he didn't need anger to shake an entire corporate machine to its core. That calmness made Mallory cry harder as she collapsed into a chair, covering her face. "I'm sorry if I had known." Respect Daniel interrupted his tone, neither harsh nor gentle. But carrying a quiet sorrow is not reserved for people with power. Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity. The lobby was so silent they could hear the air conditioning whisper through the vents. Every eye turned toward Daniel, not out of fear, but because, for the first time, they saw the true character of the man who had just been humiliated, yet chose to rise above that humiliation, to speak the truth. Charlotte bowed her head to him once more. "We will make this right, I promise." And in that dense, motionless silence, everyone understood one thing. The storm had not even begun, but the presence of Daniel Carter alone was enough to rewrite the future of this place. The air inside Everest National Bank now felt suspended between two worlds, one built on arrogance dismissal and the certainty of being right, and another that had collapsed in an instant under the weight of an 8-second phone call from the man they had assumed was suspicious. Charlotte Reed stood tall, her posture steady, but her eyes carrying the sharpness of someone who had weathered countless crises, though never one caused by the very people she trusted. She scanned the lobby, as if imprinting every face, the ones who had silently watched the ones who lowered their gaze to avoid meeting Daniel's eyes, the ones who had grown used to ignoring injustice as long as it didn't touch them. "I want to know exactly what happened from the beginning," Charlotte said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. No one answered. The silence was a mirror reflecting their cowardice. Then a small, trembling voice emerged from the right side of the counter. Emily Rhodes, a 26-year-old employee who had been frozen like a statue, swallowed hard before speaking. I saw everything. He only wanted to transfer money, He didn't do anything wrong. Mallory whipped around her eyes, wild as if she had just been betrayed. You be quiet. You don't understand. But Emily shook her head, and for the first time looked directly at Mallory with the courage that had been building through years of watching the wrong things happen. No, I do understand. I've seen this happen so many times. Not just today. Not just to him. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Daniel remained still, his gaze softening as he looked at the young woman, a silent but unmistakable thank you enough to let Emily know she wasn't alone. Charlotte regarded her with sharp but gentler eyes. Can you elaborate? Emily clenched her hands, shaking slightly but refusing to back down. Anyone who doesn't look like a VIP gets treated differently by Mallory and Mr. Gray. Suspicion? Sarcasm. Some are turned away with no reason. They don't speak up because they're scared. A thin young man with thick glasses. Patrick Lee inhaled sharply before suddenly speaking. I've seen it too. For months, I wanted to report it. But Mr. Gray told me not to get involved in other people's business. Thomas Gray recoiled as if punched. You're making things up to blame me, Patrick shook his head. No. You said people like that cause trouble easily. I heard it clearly. The lobby erupted in shock. Some customers exchanged looks of anger. Others lowered their heads, realizing they too had once stayed silent. Charlotte turned to Thomas, her tone calm but cold enough to slice through bone. Would you like to explain that statement? Thomas stammered. I only said that because of work pressure. Pressure is not an excuse to become discriminatory. Charlotte replied, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a verdict. Mallory choked on her breath, mascara streaking down her cheeks, clinging desperately to whatever authority she thought she still had. I'm not prejudiced. I was just following procedure. Daniel looked at her, his eyes not angry, but carrying the deep exhaustion of someone who had endured this kind of prejudice his entire life. What procedure instructs you to look down on me? What procedure teaches you to humiliate someone just because they don't look like the customers you are used to? Mallory opened her mouth, but no answer came. In that moment, the entire bank seemed to see the truth they had all avoided. Discrimination doesn't always come from policy. It often comes from the gaze of the person given power, a gaze that had pushed countless people into feeling small while everyone else stayed silent. Daniel turned toward the customers who had been watching. I'm not angry, he said, his voice low but carrying. I'm sad. Sad that in a room full of people, only 2 young employees had the courage to speak up. A middle-aged man near the door, who had watched everything with discomfort, suddenly bowed his head. I'm sorry, he said. I saw the wrong in this from the start, but I did nothing. Daniel nodded. Silence can be more dangerous than disrespect, because it allows what is wrong to become normal. His words washed over the room like a cold wave of realization. A young woman bit her lip eyes, turning red with guilt. An elderly lady placed her hand over her heart and whispered, We've let this go on for too long. Charlotte tightened her grip on her folder, her gaze deeper and heavier. She looked at Daniel with genuine respect. You were right to call us. What happened here isn't the fault of just 2 individuals. It's a systemic failure. Daniel exhaled as if finally hearing the acknowledgement he had been waiting for. But he didn't walk away. He didn't brush it aside. He didn't end the story there. He wanted them to learn the lesson he had paid for with years of silent endurance. I don't ask anyone to bow to me, Daniel said slowly. I only ask to be treated the way any other customer would be." The bank fell silent, a silence heavy with awakening. In that hush, everyone understood that the last few minutes hadn't just exposed a mistake, they had exposed an entire mindset woven into the way people were treated. Charlotte took one firm step forward. "Mr. Carter, I promise you this branch will never return to the way it was." But Daniel responded with a single sentence, soft as a breeze, yet powerful enough to send the entire room into deep reflection. "I hope so. Because sometimes it isn't the system that's broken, it's people who forget how to look at each other as human beings. And under the pale white lights of the bank, everyone knew one truth. From this day forward, Everest National Bank had entered a new chapter, a chapter no one expected would be opened by such a quiet man. Charlotte Reed stood in the center of the bank lobby like a steel pillar, her expression cold as ice, yet in the depths of her eyes lay unmistakable disappointment. A woman with nearly 3 decades in finance, someone who had handled hundreds of crises, had never witnessed chaos so deeply rooted as this one, a disaster not caused by system failure, but by her own employees, by people who had forgotten the responsibility tied to their profession. She turned to Daniel, her voice steady, but carrying clear resolve. "Mr. Carter, to ensure fairness, I need to hear from you what you would like us to do next." Daniel looked around, his gaze moving across the anxious, shaken faces. He saw regret in Emily's eyes, guilt in Patrick's, confusion in Lucas's, and sheer terror in Mallory's. But he also saw silence and avoidance in everyone else, people who had chosen to stand aside, who had allowed wrongdoing to unfold right in front of them, because they didn't want to get involved. He inhaled slowly. "I'm not asking for revenge," Daniel said, his deep voice echoing clearly through the silent room. "I'm asking for accountability. Not because of who I am, but because if I were just another ordinary customer, what would happen to them? Who would protect them?" Charlotte nodded, as if she had been waiting for exactly that. She turned to the staff. "Everyone directly involved in this incident will be handled according to corporate disciplinary regulations." Lucas Dean tightened his hands. He knew he wasn't the one who initiated the confrontation, but he had approached Daniel, ready to restrain him without a moment's thought. Shame flickered in his eyes. Lucas began, but Daniel gently raised his hand to stop him. "I don't blame you," Daniel said. "You followed your manager's signal. Your mistake was not questioning it, and you weren't the only one." Several employees lowered their heads. Mallory sat frozen in her chair, shoulders trembling. She looked at Charlotte as if staring at the final storm of her life. I didn't mean to," Mallory choked out. I just thought, you thought wrong." Daniel said, not angry, but unyieldingly firm. "Wrong from the moment you looked at me with judgment." Mallory burst into tears, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. "If I had known you were the largest shareholder," Daniel asked calmly. "And if I wasn't, you would have treated me the same way, wouldn't you?" Mallory remained silent, and that silence was the truest confession. Charlotte inhaled sharply. "Mallory Price, Mr. Gray, you are both suspended immediately. Once the disciplinary board reviews this case, it is highly likely your contracts will be terminated." Thomas Gray jumped to his feet, shouting in panic. "Charlotte, you can't do that. I've given 13 years to this bank. And it only took 1 day for you to destroy the reputation of the entire system." Charlotte replied, her voice cold as steel. "You forgot that a manager's most important responsibility is not protecting numbers, but protecting people." Thomas went still. He stared at Daniel, eyes red, filled with fear and rage, unable to comprehend how the man he had belittled could dismantle his career in such a short moment. But Daniel didn't look back. He had long known men like Thomas, men who respected power, but not people. Meanwhile, another voice rose in the lobby. An older customer who had watched everything with discomfort now stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I want to apologize on behalf of all of us who stayed silent. We let this go on for too long, and none of us spoke up." Daniel offered a faint smile. "Change doesn't come from apologies," he said. "It comes from action." His words startled many. Emily, her eyes red, took a small step forward. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. If I had done it before, maybe none of this would have escalated this far." "No one blames you," Daniel replied. "What matters is that you spoke today. You are the reason I still believe this system can be fixed." Emily bit her lip, fighting tears. Patrick bowed his head in silent gratitude. Charlotte looked at the two young employees, her stern expression softening into genuine respect. "You two have shown what this bank has been missing," she said. "Not skills, not performance, but courage." Then she turned back to Daniel. "Mr. Carter, regarding your decision to withdraw all your funds from our system, that decision wasn't to punish," Daniel said. "I want everyone to understand that disrespect has a cost. But more importantly, this system needs to look at itself again." Charlotte nodded slowly. "And we will, whatever it takes." In that moment, something shifted in the room. It was no longer just fear, no longer chaos. It was awakening a deep awareness that they stood at the threshold between the past and a new era Daniel had unintentionally opened. Daniel surveyed the lobby one last time. The air conditioner still hummed above the white lights, still glowed over the cold metal counters. But now every gaze directed at him was different. No more suspicion, no more dismissal, but recognition that they had misjudged him from the first moment. "What I hope," Daniel said, his voice deep enough to resonate through the room, "is that from today forward, anyone who walks into this bank, whoever they are, will be treated with the respect they deserve." No one replied. They simply stood there, struck silent by a truth they had forgotten. Sometimes it takes only one person, one voice, one act of bravery to change an entire system. And today that person was Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter stood in the center of Everest National Bank, inside a space that had just survived an earthquake, with him at its epicenter. Yet he remained the quietest epicenter imaginable. His silence unsettled people more than shouting ever could, more than the chaos that had swallowed the branch moments earlier. He didn't need to assert dominance, didn't need to slam a desk or raise his voice, yet his words had shaken the very foundation Thomas and Mallory once believed was untouchable. Charlotte Reed remained beside him, her gaze never leaving the employees scattered across the lobby. She refused to miss even the slightest expression, the remorse in the young workers, the fear gripping those who had abused their authority, the shame weighing on customers, and the late dawning awareness in the ones who had chosen silence. But her eyes lingered longest on Daniel, the man standing before her, like someone who had just delivered a verdict without needing a courtroom. "Mr. Carter," Charlotte said softly, "I know this system can still be repaired, and I promise I will begin that process today." Daniel looked at her, his expression neither angry nor triumphant. It held only weariness, the kind born from seeing this pattern far too many times to still be surprised. "I hope you do it for the people who walk in here," Daniel replied. "Not for me." Charlotte dipped her head slightly as if acknowledging a solemn vow. Then Daniel turned slowly, letting his eyes sweep across every face one final time. When his gaze met Emily's, she nearly forgot to breathe. For a moment, she feared he would call out her months of silence, her failure to speak sooner. But he simply said, "Thank you." Emily blinked in confusion. "I only did what I should have done." "Yes," Daniel said, "but in a room where most choose silence, the one who speaks is the strongest." Patrick, standing nearby, bowed his head to hide his reddening eyes. Lucas Dean shifted a step closer, so embarrassed he couldn't decide whether to look at Daniel or at the floor. "I'm sorry," Lucas murmured. "I acted without thinking." "You followed orders." Daniel replied, his voice free of blame. "But next time, ask yourself the right questions. Sometimes a wrong order is more dangerous than a wrong action." Lucas nodded, his face collapsing with shame, yet lifted slightly by the relief of forgiveness. Mallory, meanwhile, was a shadow of herself. Her face was swollen and streaked with ruined mascara, her hands trembling as if the world around her no longer made sense. She tried to form words, but none came out. Daniel didn't linger on her, not because he didn't care, but because her mistake was not unusual to him. It was something he had seen too many times in his life. Then he walked toward the exit, each step slow and firm, the footsteps of a man who had laid down a truth no one could ignore. But before he pushed the door open, Daniel stopped. He turned back, and the entire lobby held its breath. "There's one thing I want all of you to understand," Daniel said, his voice low, but carrying undeniable force, every syllable cutting through the room. "Respect is not a privilege. It is a foundation. When a system only behaves correctly under supervision, that system is broken. It is issuing a warning." His words fell over the room like a cold snowfall. No one spoke. No one dared move. Everyone seemed frozen by a truth they had feared to face, but could no longer escape. Daniel pushed the door open and stepped out, sunlight falling across his face. There was no triumph in him, no victory, just the calm resignation of a man who had lived with injustice too long to feel proud for surviving it, yet another time. But inside the bank, a different storm was beginning. Charlotte immediately turned to the senior managers who had accompanied her. "I want a full report. Every employee present today. Every word spoken. Every incident of customer complaints in the past 6 months." "Yes, Ms. Reed." "And call an immediate regional meeting. I want every branch to review their customer treatment protocols, especially cases involving customers labeled as not suitable." Hearing that, Thomas's face drained to ash. He stumbled back like he wished he could disappear into the walls. But Charlotte no longer spared him a glance. His importance was gone. As the door closed behind Daniel, it felt like someone had squeezed the heart of the entire room. Emily broke into quiet sobs, overwhelmed by relief and fear. Patrick collapsed into a chair. Lucas leaned against the wall, exhaling like he had escaped a nightmare. Mallory buried her face in her hands, her crying muffled between her fingers. A customer approached the counter and sighed. "I hope all of you learned something from this, because I know I did." Charlotte surveyed the room, her expression not angry, but impossibly heavy. "Today will be reported to the highest level," she said. "But more importantly, each of you will have to face this day for the rest of your careers." No one answered. There were no excuses left worth speaking. Outside, Daniel walked on in silence, and with every step he took behind him was a system that had just been shaken awake from years of blind complacency, and the time to pay the price had finally arrived. Daniel Carter stepped out through the glass doors of Everest National Bank like a man closing an old chapter, yet the aftershocks behind him continued to expand with every trembling breath of those left inside. The air within the branch felt as heavy as a layer of ash settling after an explosion. No one dared speak loudly. No one dared move quickly. Everyone standing like sinners who had just seen the verdict hanging above their heads. Charlotte Reed remained in the center of the lobby, the lone anchor in the chaos, though her face had sunk under the weight of disappointment she had tried not to reveal too soon. Document everything. Do not leave out a single detail, she instructed the two senior managers beside her. Her voice wasn't loud, yet it sent chills down the spines of every employee in the room. Those who had stood on the sidelines, those who thought the situation had nothing to do with them, now felt as if the floor beneath them was trembling. No one dared to stand tall. Everyone lowered their heads, trying to avoid Charlotte's eyes, and the memory of their own guilty silence. Emily Rhodes stood near the counter, her eyes still red from tears. She stared at the door Daniel had just walked through, admiration and remorse twisting in her chest. "I should have spoken up long ago," she whispered to herself, fingers gripping the hem of her blouse. Patrick Lee stepped beside her, silent for a moment, before letting out a long breath. "You're not the only one," he said, voice tired. "I've seen this happening for months, but every time I wanted to say something I got scared. Scared of being seen as a troublemaker, scared of losing hours, scared of never being promoted. Scared of everything." Emily turned to him, her eyes sad but steadier. "And we let it continue. We let today happen." Patrick lowered his head. The two young employees stood together in a moment that made everyone else feel something uncomfortable. They had no real power, yet their late courage now exposed everyone else's cowardice. Across the room, Mallory Price sat collapsed on a chair, her face streaked with mascara smeared into every wrinkle of panic. Her hand still trembled beyond control, her breaths short and uneven. She clung to the faintest hope that she could still salvage something. "Charlotte, I can explain. I didn't mean," she choked, but Charlotte looked at her with a weary, cutting indifference. "You don't need to explain anything to me," Charlotte said. "You need to ask yourself why you ever believed a customer didn't deserve respect." Mallory bit her lips so hard it bled her eyes, unfocused, like someone who had lost the map of her life. For the first time in years, she no longer looked like a woman who controlled everything. She looked like someone standing before consequences she had built with her own hands. Thomas Gray was no better. He leaned against the counter, his face pale as ash. Every word Daniel spoke, every furious stare from employees, every nod from Charlotte struck him like a hammer, shattering the persona he had constructed for years. "All because of a customer I didn't recognize," he muttered, voice hollow, stripped of the arrogance he once carried. No, Charlotte's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Not because you didn't recognize who he was, but because you didn't recognize the value of a human being." Thomas swallowed, eyes red, a man watching his career crumble into smoke. At the far end of the lobby, a group of customers still stood rooted to the spot. They couldn't leave because they knew they had just witnessed something rare, a moment when truth exposed injustice so clearly no one could deny it. A middle-aged woman spoke first, her voice low and heavy. "I'm ashamed of all of us. We've grown too used to judging people who don't fit our expectations. A man beside her nodded. I've seen this happen elsewhere, but I never imagined it could be this blatant. Their confessions spread among the customers like a slow, painful domino effect. Inside, Charlotte tilted her head toward her management team. I want immediate retrieval of the camera footage, everything from this morning until now, and all customer complaint reports labeled as unsuitable clients from the last 3 months. A senior employee whispered, "Do you want to handle this internally first or wait for the regional board report internally first?" Charlotte said without hesitation. "I need to clean the foundation before presenting anything to the board. We will not let today be dismissed as an isolated incident." As she said that, the entire bank felt itself sinking into the realization of an impending purge. Those who had contributed to the bias swallowed hard, and those who had stayed silent began to feel fear because silence was complicity. Outside, Daniel Carter continued walking with a calmness no one could understand. Yet with every step he took, Everest National Bank was being forced to face itself at the roots. No more hiding. No more blaming procedure. No more looking away from the truth. Charlotte took a deep breath and delivered the final sentence, the one everyone knew would change everything. Today does not end here. It will spread across the entire region, and every one of us, every person in this room, will face a choice change or be swept away. And in that moment, the entire branch understood that the earthquake Daniel brought wasn't the conclusion, it was the beginning of a transformation that would shake the entire system. The regional headquarters of Everest National Bank sat under a pale, fading gold light that late afternoon, but the atmosphere inside was as dense as a storm compressed within 4 glass walls. Rushed footsteps echoed across the marble floors, laptop keys clattered in frantic bursts, and phones rang non-stop as if the entire building were struggling to breathe. It was unmistakably one of the most intense afternoons in its operational history. An emergency meeting had been called not the next morning, as procedures usually dictated, but within 2 hours of Daniel Carter leaving the branch. The 15th floor conference room, normally reserved for high-profile partnership signings, now served as the battlefield for confronting the collapse of one of their own branches. Charlotte Reed entered with a thick folder in hand, her eyes carrying the weight of an oncoming storm. The other branch managers were already seated around the table, many still unaware of the full extent of what had happened, having only received messages describing a serious incident and that the largest shareholder is demanding a report. When the doors closed, Charlotte stood tall, surveying the tense faces, waiting for answers. "We have a systemic problem," Charlotte began, her voice steady, but each word landing with the weight of stone. "Not an isolated mistake. Not the fault of one individual. It is a failure rooted in the very mindset of our operations." Harrison Doyle, a manager in his early 50s with neatly combed silver hair, frowned. I read the summary report, but all of this over one customer being mistreated. Charlotte's gaze froze over like a lake in winter. "That customer," she said slowly, "was Daniel Carter." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Several managers leaned forward as if their ears had betrayed them. A young woman from the North Side region blurted, "That's impossible. Mr. Carter is extremely private. I've worked 10 years and never once seen him visit a branch." Charlotte nodded. "Exactly. And because he so rarely appears, those who don't understand a culture of customer respect are even more likely to make dangerous assumptions." She opened her folder and laid out a stack of printed images footage captured from security cameras, showing Mallory's expression, the way she flicked his documents aside, Lucas's suspicious stare, the arrogant posture of Thomas Gray. Every frame was as clear and raw as an unfiltered documentary. "This is what Mr. Carter witnessed in 7 minutes," Charlotte said. "And this is why he moved all of his accounts out of our system. He did not demand privilege. He demanded basic respect, something we failed to deliver." Another manager rose to his feet, trying to disguise panic behind his thick glasses. We didn't anticipate things were this bad." "No," Charlotte replied. "Because we have forgotten the most fundamental principle customers do not need, to state who they are to be treated decently." She paused, then continued, her voice heavy like a warning bell. "And now Mr. Carter has requested a board of directors meeting tonight." The room straightened instantly, the collective panic dropping to their stomachs. "Mr. Carter is known for avoiding public attention," Charlotte said. "But if he steps forward, it means the situation has already crossed every boundary." No one spoke. Only the soft hum of the air conditioning blended into the suffocating tension. "Some of you believe this is a rare incident," Charlotte continued. "But recent reports say otherwise. Delaying transactions for customers who look unreliable, refusing to explain procedures, making vague remarks that lead to discriminatory outcomes." Harrison opened his mouth to protest. "But we have a risk identification process." "The process does not include condescension," Charlotte cut in. "The process does not teach anyone to judge customers based on clothing voice or skin color. Yet our staff is doing exactly that." The room fell silent again. One manager spoke up quickly. "So what is the next step? What is Mr. Carter demanding?" Charlotte took a deep breath. "A full investigation and a restructuring of regional management. He didn't spell it out, but the meaning is obvious. Either we change or we will be replaced." The news sliced through the room like a blade. A few managers swallowed hard. Some stared at the table, their hands trembling as though they had just received a verdict. A younger manager from the Midtown branch spoke quietly, fear gripping his voice. "If Mr. Carter loses trust, the board won't stop at replacing management." Charlotte nodded. "I know. He has the power to trigger a full domino effect." Outside the sunset slid lower along the glass panels, painting the conference room in a fading gold that resembled an era nearing its end. "But we still have a chance," Charlotte said. "A chance to prove this system can be repaired. A chance to show Mr. Carter that what he did today won't be meaningless." Someone asked softly, "Our last chance?" "You may call it that," Charlotte replied. "But I believe we should treat it as a beginning, not an ending." She looked around the table, meeting every anxious pair of eyes. "Tonight," Charlotte said, "each of us will answer one question. Are we building a system that serves customers or one that serves prejudice?" No one responded. No one dared. But in that silence, for the first time in years, they truly looked inward. Charlotte closed the folder, and the sharp click of the cover sounded like the declaration of an era about to be rewritten. "Prepare yourselves. Mr. Carter does not want apologies. He wants answers." And Everest National Bank, whether ready or not, had stepped into the moment where its history would be rewritten. When the clock struck 6:45 in the evening, the Board of Directors conference room at Everest National Bank's headquarters glowed brightly under its ceiling lights, yet not a single person inside felt any warmth from them. The atmosphere was stretched so tightly, it seemed one wrong breath could snap it in half. The most powerful figures in the company, from the chairman of the board, the chief operating officer, the head of risk management, to the general legal counsel, were all present, sitting upright, as if preparing to receive someone they would never dare underestimate. They had watched the camera footage. They had read the report Charlotte submitted. They had heard about the 8-second phone call that froze an entire branch. But what silenced them most was a single sentence Charlotte had written in her message to the board. Mr. Carter has lost confidence. It was the sentence every bank, every financial institution, every corporation dependent on a major shareholder feared more than any red number in a quarterly report. And at exactly 7 o'clock, the door to the conference room opened. Daniel Carter entered, without spectacle, without an entourage, without any display of authority. Just a calm, quiet man, walking with deliberate steadiness. Yet his very composure made the entire room rise to its feet, as if by instinct. The chairman, Richard Coleman, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," he said, trying to sound natural, though tension betrayed him. "Thank you for coming." Daniel merely nodded, pulled out a chair and sat down at the head of the table, a seat no one except the chairman had ever taken. But tonight, no one objected. No one dared. "I have reviewed everything," Daniel began, his voice, low but resonant, each word landing with unmistakable weight. Not just the footage, but the reactions of the staff, the behavior of management, and how the system functions when no one is watching. The room froze into absolute silence. Daniel set a small stack of papers on the table, not thick, not a formal dossier, just a few pages of notes. "I won't make a long speech," he continued. "But I will be direct. We do not have a procedural problem. We have a people problem." A few senior executives shifted slightly, but none dared interrupt. Daniel turned to the first page, speaking without looking down, as though every line was already engraved in his mind. "Our staff treats customers as if they have the right to decide who deserves respect. Our managers believe they can decide who belongs in this bank and who does not. And worse, many people watched and chose silence." Chairman Coleman inhaled deeply. "We accept responsibility," he said, "but we need to know, what do you want us to do?" The entire room held its breath. Daniel stayed quiet for a moment, his fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the table. The faint tension in his hand revealed what his voice did not. He wasn't angry, but he was deeply, profoundly disappointed. "I want a complete restructuring," Daniel said. "Not a long-term project, not a yearly plan, immediately." An older woman, the chief of human resources, asked carefully, "Mr. Carter, restructuring to what extent?" Daniel looked straight into her eyes. "From the roots to the branches." Coleman swallowed hard. It means, Daniel, cut in gentle but unyielding. Every manager connected to any form of discriminatory conduct, including vague or suggestive language, must be reviewed. Anyone unfit must go. A wave of electric tension rippled through the room. Some executives went pale. Daniel continued, "I want a full overhaul of our corporate culture training. Mandatory, no exceptions." And he added, his voice steady, as he looked each senior leader in the eye, "I want the creation of an independent oversight department, not managed by any branch or region. This department reports directly to the board, and to me." Several high-ranking leaders nearly shot out of their seats in shock. Such a change would drastically diminish their power, but none dared protest. "Do you believe we can change the entire system's culture with these measures?" someone asked cautiously. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "No," he said. "I believe we can only begin to change." The humility in that answer deepened the silence. Daniel leaned back, his eyes shadowed with years of understanding. I have lived through too many moments of judgment, suspicion and exclusion, simply because I did not look like the customers some people think belong here. But today I did not act for myself. His voice deepened. I acted for the people who have no voice, the ones whose names will never be spoken in any room like this, the ones who are turned away before they have a chance to prove anything. The painful truth of that admission tightened the entire room. Daniel rose to his feet. I do not ask for apologies. I ask for change. Chairman Coleman slowly stood as well, followed by every member present. Mr. Carter, he said, voice lower than usual. We will do everything you ask. And more. Daniel nodded. Do it for the customers, not for me. He picked up his folder, slipped it inside his jacket. Before leaving the room, he turned back, his gaze, calm but piercing. We do not fail because of mistakes. We fail because we normalize them. Then he pushed open the door and walked out, leaving behind a room full of motionless figures, people who had just seen a truth they no longer had the privilege to ignore. Everest National Bank didn't yet know that tonight marked the beginning of the most sweeping transformation in its history, and it all began with a man who walked into a branch as an ordinary customer, but walked out as a reckoning for an entire system. Before the sun could slip between the towering glass buildings the next morning, Everest National Bank had already become a miniature social stress test, exploding across its internal networks. The Public Relations Department's report, sent to the executives at 6 o'clock, contained only one blazing red headline: Internal Customer Network Video, Circulating Risk of System-Wide Loss of Trust. The footage from the branch had not leaked to the public, but it did not need to. Once it began circulating through the internal network of corporate clients and employees, it became a wildfire. Employee comments appeared one after another, like shards of a shattered mirror, reflecting truths no one had dared to speak aloud. I've seen this happen before. It happens at my branch, too, just with different people. Unbelievable that they targeted the largest shareholder. If it hadn't been him, this would have been buried. The confession spread faster than any report Charlotte had ever read, and they made one thing unmistakably clear: discrimination had existed within the system, as a dangerous habit no one wanted to confront. Meanwhile, at the branch where everything began, the air was so heavy that no one dared speak more than 3 sentences. Customers who had learned about the previous day's incident returned not to complain, but to observe. They said nothing, but they watched carefully. Emily Rhodes stood at her counter with an entirely different presence, no longer the fearful employee afraid of retaliation, but someone who had realized that speaking up at the right moment could create real change. She assisted an older woman with her transaction, offering a gentle smile, her eyes still tired but filled with new clarity. "I saw what happened yesterday," the woman whispered, soft but steady. "You were brave." Emily paused, then bowed her head in gratitude. But that gratitude carried more than politeness. It carried the weight of finally listening to what her conscience had urged her to do for years. Patrick Lee at the next counter had changed too. He greeted customers with clearer confidence, lifting his head more often. He no longer avoided customers who didn't look like they belonged, but welcomed them with genuine respect. Lucas Dean, the security officer, stood at the front door with a posture no longer rigid and defensive. His eyes were softer. He no longer looked at customers with the subconscious suspicion he had not even realized he possessed. A black gentleman walked in. Lucas immediately greeted him, his tone natural. "Good morning, sir." How can I assist you today?" The man responded casually, but as he walked past, he smiled a small smile, yet enough to ease something weighted inside Lucas. Inside the manager's office, Thomas Gray's chair was still there, but empty. A staff member peeked in and whispered, "Strange yesterday. He acted like he owned that seat, like nothing could touch him. Turns out no one's untouchable," another murmured. "Yesterday proved that." Mallory Price sat in the break room, her eyes drained. She was no longer crying only because she had cried herself dry. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had pointed at customers' hands that once believed they had the authority to judge. Now they rested on her lap, trembling lost, as if she no longer understood the world unfolding around her. If only I had just treated him like any other customer, she thought. But if only could not save her now. At headquarters, Charlotte Reed had worked through the night. As dawn light spilled into her office, she reviewed the preliminary report. Initial assessment shows 17 branches exhibiting signs of customer bias based on appearance, language, or preconceived judgment. She set the papers aside and rubbed her temples. "We've been asleep for far too long," she muttered. At that moment, her desk phone rang. A single name flashed on the screen: Daniel Carter. Charlotte took a breath and answered. "I've reviewed the preliminary report," Daniel said immediately without small talk. "You moved faster than I expected." "We had to," Charlotte replied. "For you. For our customers. For ourselves." Daniel was silent for a moment. "Not for me," he said. "Do it for the people who will never have a voice in last night's boardroom." Charlotte nodded slowly, even though he could not see her. "I understand." Daniel continued. "I'm going to the branch where the incident occurred. Not to reprimand. I want to meet the people who spoke up." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. Yes, Emily and Patrick deserved that. They deserved recognition, validation, and the chance to know their courage mattered. "I'll arrange everything," Charlotte said. When the call ended, she looked out through the glass wall of her office. The city moved on as usual, unaware that this morning a major bank had begun rewriting itself from the ground up. And it all began with the moment a man dismissed and underestimated chose to stand still. That moment had become the spark, forcing an entire system to awaken. For the first time in years, Everest National Bank was no longer avoiding the truth. It was opening its eyes and rediscovering the responsibility it should have upheld all along. That afternoon, the glass doors of the Everest National Bank branch opened once more. But this time there were no shouts, no condescension, no hurried steps rushing to restrain anyone. Everyone stood upright, tidied their posture, and fell silent when they saw Daniel Carter walk in with Charlotte Reed. He was no longer the man denied a transaction, no longer the victim of prejudice, but the one carrying the moral weight of an entire system. Emily Rhodes was organizing documents at her counter when she saw Daniel. Her breath caught for half a second before she instinctively straightened her hands, trembling faintly. Patrick beside her reacted the same, losing a beat before regaining composure. Lucas Dean, stationed at the entrance, immediately stepped aside and opened the path, lowering his head slightly in a gesture of formal respect. Mallory was not present suspended, and Thomas Gray had already received notice of a special investigation. There were no more dismissive eyes, no more arrogant tones, no more complicit silence. Only people finally learning to stand where they should have stood all along, on the side of justice, not against it. Daniel did not smile, but his gaze softened slightly when he looked at Emily and Patrick. Charlotte stepped forward and said, "Mr. Carter wanted to meet the people who stood up." Emily swallowed hard. But when Daniel approached, she lifted her chin. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry for Daniel," gently raised his hand to stop her. "You do not need to apologize. You did the right thing." Emily blinked, her eyebrows twitching. "I only wish I had done it sooner." "You did it when it mattered most," Daniel replied, his voice low but warm. "That timing is what counts." Patrick took a deep breath and stepped forward. We stayed silent for too long. Starting today, that won't happen again. Daniel looked at both of them with a kind of recognition they had never received from any leader, an acknowledgement of their worth, not just their performance. "This system won't change because of the person at the top," Daniel said. "It will change because of the people on the front line. The people who dare to speak the truth in a room full of those who choose silence." The entire branch fell still. His words, the quiet, echoed more deeply than any formal speech ever could. Lucas Dean hesitated, then stepped closer. "Mr. Carter, I just want to say, thank you for not treating me like a bad person." Daniel turned toward him, calm and steady. "You are not a bad person, but remember this power, no matter how small, always comes with responsibility." Lucas bowed his head, offering a wordless answer that was more sincere than anything he could have said aloud. Charlotte watched the scene unfold with a rare feeling hope. She stepped beside Daniel and addressed the entire branch. "Today, Mr. Carter is not here to reprimand you. He is here to show that we can be better, and we will be better." Some employees nodded. Others looked down, ashamed, but relieved that they now had a chance to change. Daniel signaled that he had one final message. Everyone immediately turned their attention to him. "Yesterday, Daniel said, you witnessed a lesson, not a lesson about power, but about dignity." He took one step forward, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Respect is not for the wealthy. Respect is not for those dressed well. Respect is not for those who look like VIPs. Respect is for anyone who walks through these doors." No one exhaled loudly. Not a single whisper stirred. Each word landed like a milestone they would never forget. "If you hold on to that," Daniel said, "this bank will grow. Not because of money, but because of trust." Daniel turned toward the exit, preparing to leave. But before stepping through the door, he paused. The entire branch held its breath. Without turning back, he said, "A system is only as good as the people who run it." Then he walked out, slow and steady, like a man who had just reset the foundation of an entirely new path. As the doors closed behind him, Everest National Bank was no longer the same branch. It felt reborn, not through procedures, not through documents, but through an awakening within every person inside it. One quiet man had changed an entire system, and the legacy of that moment would echo for a very long time. From the perspective of a specialist in organizational culture and professional ethics, Daniel Carter's story is far more than an incident at a service counter. It is a profound reminder of how a system can drift away from its core values through small habits, biased glances, and prolonged silence. True power does not lie in the percentage of shares someone owns or the title printed on their business card, but in the ability to compel an entire structure to reassess itself through calm, precise action that requires no noise. Every transformation begins the moment people realize what they have forgotten. And on that day, at Everest National Bank, a man who had been misjudged opened the door for the entire system to rediscover its most essential virtue, respect for human beings, regardless of who they are. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that dignity, should never depend on appearance or status. Please like the video to help spread this message further. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on more journeys where justice is illuminated through kindness and new perspectives on power. Before you leave, drop a comment with exactly 3 words, your own expression of the value this story stands for. Hold your respect.